Join us today on Beyond the Lair, where we have a conversation with Edgard Villanueva Cruz, an Indigenous youth, leader, and entrepreneur. He talks about the value of youth of today and tomorrow and the influence and impact they have. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Lair. My name is Gina Jackson Montgomery.
And I'm Dean Montgomery.
And we are so excited today because we have a very important friend and colleague and considered family, Edgard Villanueva Cruz. Edgard is a budding leader and entrepreneur, engrained with a mission to support the needs of Indigenous youth, economies, and communities. As a proud Tahltan member and a confident, engaging facilitator, Edgard leverages his leadership skills honed through mentorship and hands-on experience to drive impactful initiatives in youth leadership, policy development, and the dreams of Indigenous youth. Welcome to our program, Edgard.
Thank you so much, Gina. Edgard Ushie, Siskia, Estatsei, Tahltan Jasini, Vancouver Naste. Madhu for bringing me on, and I'm so excited and so ready to share a little bit about my story and inspire and educate and elevate the people that will be taking a great listen to what we produce today.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up and what made you the person that you are today? Because I think it's always good to reflect on yesterday and the steps that made you who you are.
You know, there's a lot of experiences I had growing up. I grew up in Ross River and Lower Post, which is two very northern communities in the Yukon and British Columbia. And I grew up with my grandmother and my grandparents, really learning how to hunt, learning how to be on the land, and really coming to understand the critical importance of our ways of life and how we uphold those and support those. And I actually had the great opportunity as a child. My grandmother was in leadership, and so I'd be brought to different meetings, and I'd be sitting in the corner, playing with a few different little toys and taking a kind of listen. But one of those really key lessons and experiences that shaped me into who I am today is definitely witnessing my grandmother and being raised by her partially, and guarding those experiences and looking up to a matriarch within our family and within our community.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like in Ross River? What were you interested in? And then maybe a little bit more about the rest of your family.
Yeah, so growing up in Ross River, I bore a lot of witness to different political activities with my grandmother, and as well as the culture and the connection to the land and the value of our moose and hunting, from being out in bush camp, from setting trap lines. But in addition to all of that, our community also comes with its own set of challenges, just as many other Indigenous communities across Canada do as well. And those challenges go as far as alcoholism, addiction, lateral violence, and poverty. Growing up, I didn't really recognize, and literacy was definitely one of the greatest challenges I witnessed. When I was in elementary school in Ross River, the students and my peers, my cousins, were so far behind the rest of the education system. And that's something I began to learn as I gone off reserve and began to develop these different experiences. And at Lower Post, it was kind of the same thing I'd witnessed, right? We are in a very small rural community. We lack capacity for education. I had one teacher in a school with 40 children who was attempting to teach us a variety of subjects, from mathematics to English to social sciences. And those kind of disparities and those kind of misrepresentations of who we are as Indigenous peoples that has been imposed upon us is what I like to reflect on when it comes to those experiences and how I grew up. You know, from Ross River, I grew up hunting and learning how to skin a moose at a very young age. I shot my first moose at 10 years old with a .22 Winchester repeater, right? And those kind of philosophy, and that was very ceremonious, right? Shooting a moose for the first time was a very ceremonious thing and of great significance in our culture. And I will never forget that moment and those kind of feelings I get from being at home, being on the land, learning about our language, learning from our elders, and bearing witness to the powerful leadership that my communities, particularly within the Tahltan Nation, have begun to develop. As I've seen such a great change from when I was a child to how we're doing things today. and really empowering those youth. So when it comes to those things like education, and it's not just 40 kids in a classroom that is being taught by one person who doesn't have the competency as a group of teachers may have in a variety of subjects. So for me, it's really important when I reflect upon those experiences growing up in Ross River in the community. Okay, well, where have we been and where are we going to go? Right? Are some of those questions that are always coming to mind when it comes to that kind of reflection on growing up.
And like most of us, you have a mixed ancestry. So where did Villanueva come from? Villanueva Cruz.
Yeah, so Villanueva Cruz comes from my father. Rest in peace. He passed away, unfortunately, about 2 years ago now almost. And he came from El Salvador. And so a little bit of an interesting thing is that as being from El Salvador, or the Nahuatl, which is the indigenous group down there, we are also Obsidian people, whereas the Tahltan, which I am also a member of the nation, are also an Obsidian people as well. So it was almost like it was Creator's plan for my mother and father to come together and to meet and ultimately give birth to me. And yeah, he had escaped a civil war, right? He fought in a civil war at 16 years old and came here seeking political asylum and lived here, worked here, and played here. And yeah, he taught me a lot about who I am and the kind of man that I got to be.
How did your parents meet?
So it's actually kind of a funny story. And I actually only heard it for the first time after my dad had passed. And my dad had run into a woman and he was like, wow, you're very beautiful, in broken English. And he was like, I'd like to get to know you and, come my how, because he couldn't say house. And so he's calling her, and he's like, come over. And she said, all right, well, I'm going to bring my friend because I haven't met you yet. That friend was my mother. And so as the story goes is that when they came through the door, he walked straight past the first woman he had begun talking to and was like, who are you? And that was that. That was the story right there.
That's very interesting. So being raised by a matriarch, and I know that a lot of Indigenous people are raised by their grandparents and their grandmother. In my family, my Granny Jackson raised 17 grandkids because the parents either weren't able or had too young or came to addiction or whatever it may be. But it's really important to have those matriarch teachings. How was that when you were a teenager? Because I know that, we're very good children when we listen, and especially with a matriarch like your grandma, how you said that she was taking to you meetings and a leader and what have you in the community. When you're a teenager, how did that work? Were you always a very good, diligent child, or were you a regular teenager?
So as a teenager, as everybody had some of those ideas around matriarchy and upholding that kind of responsibility, I was a young guy. Right. I think particularly during my teenage years, I always recognized and understood the authority that my grandmother had within our family and within our community. Right. And if there were times where I was doing something that was, pretty negative or potentially harmful, and it had come down to my grandma, that was the last thing I'd want to hear. Right. And the last thing I'd want to have happen. Being a youth, I was a pretty rebellious kid. We moved here to Vancouver from Whitehorse, Yukon, after living in Lower Post and Ross River. And we were only supposed to stay here for a year. And we're like, okay, the year comes by. And my mother's like, do you guys want to go home? We're like, nope, we're here. Vancouver's our new home. And going into high school, I was looking for my tribe, right? Looking for my crowd. What kind of identity can I have? How can I have fun and socialized? And ultimately kind of ended up getting caught in some of the wrong crowd, right? And participating in various illicit activities and really, kind of lost and I lost for mentorship and guidance and things like that. But in regards to matriarchy, I was taken under the wing of a community. And this community came in the form of Aboriginal life and community in Vancouver Enhancement Society. And through this, I was introduced to various matriarchs within our community, the likes of Diana Day. And they had helped shape me into the young leader that I am today, right? And always heeding the wisdom and recognizing the importance of how women make decisions. And in high school, my biggest supporters that helped me graduate because I wasn't going to graduate were the women. from our Indigenous liaison group and the counselors and the school staff, right? They are the people that helped me to complete high school and then go on to pursue post-secondary education, right? So matriarchy has always been a very, very critical component of my life. You know, the greatest people that supported me throughout high school were the women. I had a transition worker, and from the age of 16, as I had gone through different experiences with homelessness and some other challenges, and this woman had really helped me get access to education, get access to programs and to services that would help me transition to adulthood and also make sure that I have the community and capacity to be supported in those activities. And so it's very important to me how we recognize, uphold, and work with our matriarchs.
Nice. We met you at we had a youth summit, right? And it was fantastic. It was the first youth summit that the Bears Lair had. And, people are out speaking, and, you made a huge impression on Gina and I. And I went over to Gina and I said, "Who is this guy?" Right? It's like, he wants to speak. He's well-spoken. He uses this big house voice, and speaking his own language. And I think we just went up to you and said, "You're going to be somebody someday." And just, it's nice to meet you. And you were just a real standout of all the youth that are younger people that we've met. So, is that when things started turning around for you, or is that part of the where you started discovering yourself? Was it long before that, or?
Definitely long before. I've always been very, very spiritually connected, right, to the world around us and to ceremony, and really taking that and ingraining that within my being. And I think that kind of journey of transformation and into leadership really comes down to some very interesting spiritual experiences I garnered as a young man. And I was actually at Bible camp when one of those things had occurred. And that one experience caused me to be like, all right, I understand what I've got to do, right? I understand that I must learn my language. I must learn about my ancestors and who I am today. And that's when that journey began, and that transformation. And it was also empowered and instilled within me by many mentors. From the age of 14, about 2.5 years after that initial kind of spiritual awakening, or cultural awakening, awakening of my identity, was where I had come across some really amazing individuals who, just as you two, saw that I stand out. This kid's going to go somewhere. He's got a voice. And they took me under their wing. And for years, I was mentored almost every day, and brought amongst some of the leading minds in Indigenous academia and policy, and being able to deliberate amongst them, to discuss and to share different ideas and to ask questions, right? So that journey of transformation began long before the Bears camp. But I think being at the Bears camp, why I was there in the first place was because I'm an Indigenous youth, and I'm interested in business development. I've looked long and hard to find a space where I can connect with other Indigenous entrepreneurs who share that same passion and interest in entrepreneurship. So many months passed by. I signed up for the AFOA youth conference. I get a phone call one day, and they're like, "Edgar, where are you?" I'm like, "Who is this?" They're like, "Oh, it's me, and I'm from the AFOA youth conference. Are you coming?" Oh, I completely forgot this was happening. Where's it at? And they're like, "Oh, it's at the River Rock Casino." All right, I'll be there in an hour, right? And I flew down there as fast as I could. And I already see it's all on, so I come and take a seat in the back, and I'm observing the room, taking a look around, and being like, "Hey, who's who, right? Who's who? Who can I kind of feel that amongst these Indigenous youth that are in here that I could work with, right? I'm here to connect and to build relationships so we can build a prosperous future for us all. I'm here to build businesses, build opportunities, build relationships." And so I sat back, sitting down there quietly, and a good friend of mine, who is now turned into a really great friend, he invites me over to the table. And that's how I got introduced to Gina. And I think that really marks a really transformative step in my journey, right? Because I've done all kinds of advocacy at the highest levels of government with Indigenous nations across Canada, and even extending internationally, right? But for me, what is really meaningful and impactful is meeting the youth where they're at, That's something you always hear is meet youth where they're at. What does that mean? Well, that means we go directly to the community, meet them where they're at. And to have that kind of opportunity to actually be present and share these experiences and instill that confidence amongst these youth and belief that you can build a business and that you can be successful in this world, in this economy, that is definitely one of the most powerful things you can do. Because, as I said, I've been at all levels of advocacy, right? From grassroots to the highest level. Develop policies, develop frameworks, help negotiate with the government of Canada on things related to the Ministry of Child and Welfare, right? And trying to create these spaces for Indigenous youth to succeed and to prosper. And there's nothing any better than actually going down there, teaching these kids how to do it and showing them the way.
And for our audience, Edgard has taught, is it 16 camps now?
Yes.
So when we have a once a year conference, and we had our second annual conference last August. And we partner with AFOA, where we teach Indigenous youth 18 to 40 years old about entrepreneurism, but most importantly, life skills. And we have experts, social media do's and don'ts. We have public speaking by Fiona Forbes. We have Loa Fridvinson that talks about social media and what have you. So really learning the life skills and connecting, most importantly, connecting. Mm-hmm. And when we did meet you, that's what Dean said right away. Who is this person? But not only were you a great presenter and charismatic and held yourself up high, but the thing that impressed us the most, I think, was your need to help others, right? It's a $10,000 prize. The winning team wins $10,000, and you were out helping people from our own team, but also other people with their, stand up straight and posture and body language. And since then, we said, we need to take you with us. So since then, about a year and a half ago, you've come with us all over the country and taught 16 camps so far, and with Indigenous youth with our Bears Lair Youth Entrepreneur Program. And just so thankful that you're one of our senior coaches now.
Absolutely.
I do.
When we do travel, we travel in packs with our tribe per se. And we always get an Airbnb because we want to be connective and have dinners together and bond together as well. What really has impressed all of us is your dedication and commitment to your craft. And that is, I've never met anybody that reads more, that is consistently educating themselves. You journal, you listen to podcasts and educational programs. Every spare moment that you're not working, you're working. And you're very committed to martial arts and meditation. Can you maybe tell the audience how somebody that 22 years old can be so dedicated to so many things that we read in self-help books that would be good if you change this in your life, and you've got the whole package and your whole structure together? And maybe who inspired you to do that, or how do you put all that together?
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to that kind of, I think it really first things first, it's discipline, right? And learning how to exercise discipline. There are going to be times in life where, we're very disciplined in one area and have like absolute lack of discipline in another. And for me, it was, okay, well, how do I prioritize things, right? And that was really what it came down to. Priorities in the sense of, what are my responsibilities, right? What are the things I'm accountable to do? And if I'm not accountable to that, what are the consequences of failing to meet that accountability? And it was really instilled in me by a really great mentor of mine, Scott Clark. And I kind of almost go back to this moment where we're sitting there and he's like, what do you want to do with your life? And I think we may have actually been having a little bit of an argument during this time. And he was like, you got to cut the crap, Edgar, right? So whatever you're doing right now, in terms of your responsibilities to your people and your nation, it doesn't matter. He's like, you have to be laser focused, right? Like, block everything out and just understand that you have a core responsibility that is much greater than you, right? And to really instill that within me. And every day when I actually lived in his backyard, right? In an RV, being a houseless Indigenous youth experiencing some challenges like that. And every morning, he would take me out to a whiteboard in the kitchen and write out different ideas. And we talk about demographic transitions theory, or the world systems theory, or the ideology of Indian Act policy, right? Or the philosophical and moral leadership of Western hegemony. All these really grand ideas. And that's what fascinated me, to be like, okay, I got to get serious. And how do I get serious? Well, as per everything, we are creatures of habit. It all starts with your habits. And so for me, that kind of habitual journey, though, kind of began some time before. And we're going to backtrack a little bit and then come back to where we are, because I was reading a book called Mindset. And this is one of the most transformative and powerful books I've ever read. And I'd ask all these different questions of, do you believe you can change your life? Or do you believe you've been handed a crappy hand? And I'd be like, no, or yes, and no, and yes. And then I'd be like, well, if you answered 5 out of them, yes, then you have a fixed mindset. Or if you answered 5, you have a no. And depending on where you rank, that's the kind of mentality that you approach the world with. So I started asking people around me those exact same questions I saw in the book. And I listened to their answers, and I write them down after and be like, okay, that person has a fixed mindset, right? Like, and if I believe I want to succeed or do anything great in this life, then my mentality has got to be unbreakable, right? Like, there's nothing that can get in the way of it, nothing that can stop it. It must be absolutely unbreakable. And how do you create that? It's by creating a base. So first it starts with your mindset, and then what do you stand on? Right? Like, and for me, what I stand on is spirituality and connection. At the end of the day, you peel me all the way, what's left at the surface? Spirituality. That recognition that, we're all connected. And I think if you kind of walk like in those kind of ways, walk that kind of path where, you recognize mentality is very important. You recognize that knowledge and wisdom are also greatly important. And that, there's always that cliche quote that, it's inundated is knowledge is power, right? I was about 14 years old, and I read another quote too that was, there is no power relationship without the correlative language that constitutes it. And so I was like, what is the language of power, right? If I'm going to be this, leader and entrepreneur and support Indigenous youth and, influence them and support their capacity development and their own leadership and self-belief, then I got to be empowered myself too, right? And I got to dive within myself and figure these different things out and be like, okay, well, what really is language? And what is knowledge? And what is power? And how is that going to support Indigenous youth? And how is that going to support Indigenous reconciliation? And those kind of things, and those culture shifts and those paradigms that are always constantly evolving. So really just like, for me, it's really being critical, very critical thinker. And also understanding that, I'm at a kind of loss, right? Like I come from a strong bloodline and a strong family, but I also didn't have a whole lot of good stuff growing up, right? Just as many of these other youth did. And for me, it was like, okay, well, obviously there's nothing material that can fill these gaps that I'm missing, right? No amount of designer clothing or being a cool guy, right? And dressing in designer and being dripped out, as the youth may say, nothing could fill the gaps that I was experiencing based on a very complex model of social development and psychological development.
You've had all this deep thought, right? You've got some life experience then. And I mean, I always forget your actual age. You seem much more mature than you are. But you started, when I first met you, you'd already started a consulting firm. And you're the CEO of a consulting firm, and you've had it for a couple of years now already. So can you tell us a little bit about Turtle Island and what the vision is of it and why?
For sure. So Turtle Island Connection is a cute little consulting boutique, right? And our services are primarily within mining, governance and environmental reclamation and services. And so what we do within that kind of industry and within that field is really around technical advisory. We support companies or Indigenous First Nations groups in making more informed decisions, right? Or in how to include Indigenous youth as part of decision making, and developing some really strong governance models that are conducive to Indigenous self-determination and youth representation. And secondary to that is we also work quite heavily in how we support creating space. So amongst academia, particularly some of the entrepreneurship incubators that might be geared toward climate businesses or climate solutions. And Turtle Island Connection really plays a pivotal role in creating that space for Indigenous entrepreneurs to have access to and to also develop partnerships. Like in one of those cases, right now, there's a group in Ross River and Casca territory that we've been working with pretty closely to identify some ways to expand their portfolio and develop their capacity. They've been tasked with doing some reclamation activities and revegetation. And we're like, okay, well, how can we effectively reclaim this environment by developing a natural capital ledger and an ecosystem service marketplace and doing some really interesting stuff there and connecting them to different climate companies that are interested in doing some really, really cool biotechnology stuff. And then, the third kind of arm of our services and portfolio development is really around policy and strategic planning and innovation, right? So we work with different companies and organizations and how to implement policies that are more conducive and culturally relevant to create a more safe and welcoming space for Indigenous peoples to prosper. And in addition to that, we also, as part of that strategic policy development and technical advice, was that we really look to aim to support Indigenous equity in projects. One of the reasons why Turtle Island Connection was founded is two reasons. The first one is that I sat at a table with a chief from my community, and they're negotiating a certain percentage of equity within a project, right? Or a revenue sharing agreement. And it was a pretty big number that was being proposed. And I heard 2%. We're not going back on 2%. 2% is our maximum. We're not peeling back away from that. And I kind of just thought for a moment. And I was like, I'm pretty sure on the international stage, it's upwards of 15 to 30%, right? And in addition to that, what kind of metrics are we creating? This agreement's coming through. It's going to create jobs. It's going to generate revenue. But how is it affecting the social well-being of the community? Are we increasing the health? Are we increasing the spaces that are around? Are we increasing community? And the secondary reason as to why Turtle Island Connection was started was I was brought into a room with a few different academics, and they were like, we want to build an Indigenous mining program. And I was like, okay, well, this conversation can't stop here. We can't just have one conversation. You check the box as this is your consultation with Indigenous youth to build an Indigenous mining program. It's like, this cannot stop here. And it kind of did, right? And so I reached out again and followed up in a different capacity, this time the capacity of Turtle Island Connection, being like, hey, you guys had this meeting. You said you wanted to do this. Let's actually do this, right? And so that kind of leadership and capacity amongst Indigenous youth and agency to make decisions is the secondary reason as to why this was created. So we can be a part of the table, right? Because this revenue sharing agreement may be created, and there's some employment opportunities that exist to that. But how are we ensuring that those Indigenous youth that are receiving those employment opportunities have a degree of agency, that they can inform this? This is their land, their home, their community. They have every right to be involved in any decisions that are being made that affect their futures, their lives currently, the wildlife, and everything else under the sun.
It's very interesting perspective in respect of that we do go into communities and we teach youth, but the youth of today are the voices and decision makers of tomorrow that are going to impact the next 7 generations. And being so young and being part of a youth council that's directing the decision makers of today, particularly in the mining and natural resource sector, do you think that their voices, your voice, and their voices are being heard by not only community, but leadership that is our age, in our 50s, that perhaps take a look at you, so well spoken, so articulate, and really an anomaly because you really work on that and inspire, but sitting in front of a panel of youth telling what they think about what's going to happen in the future. How do you think that that's been received by the older generation like we are, where you're sitting at the table with 30 years experience in the mining sector as a natural resource and business?
Well, I've definitely encountered some different challenges in how people are receptive to dialogue amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, particularly within this space. But I believe the general consensus is that people are interested. They want to hear us. They want to know what our challenges are and what our needs are and the kind of ideas we're coming forward with, right? They are open to this. And, sometimes it's very challenging to change some of those institutional and archaic frameworks and structures. But, Canada has been entering quite into a transformative space over the past 10 years as it relates to Indigenous peoples being in the economy, being in leadership. And that's where I find today the ability to exercise one's voice, amongst the youth and bring that to the table has been really started to take heed and catch wind amongst various groups within the industry and within the sector. And we're continuing to be excited, and we're going to continue to campaign and create a more equitable future for us all while supporting youth leadership and decision making.
What do you see the development of youth in the next 5 to 10 years, whether in entrepreneurship or in the business world? What's happening in your opinion?
I know that too, that a statistic as well is Indigenous entrepreneurism is growing 9 times faster than any other demographic in Canada as well. So maybe you can talk to that as well.
For sure. You want to talk about the demographics? Indigenous peoples are 2 million of the population in Canada. A quarter of that population are under the ages of 15, right? And so when I think about something like that, what entrepreneurship looks like in the next 5 years, I've also seen other figures that the future of the Indigenous economy in 12 years or 11 years now is going to be 155,000 new Indigenous businesses and a $150 billion plus economy, right? So I'm not worried about the money. I'm not worried about the business development. I'm not worried about this youth very much. The only thing I'm worried about is the cultural relevance, cultural identity within business. I learned something in international business, and it's like, if I'm going to Japan, I'm doing Japanese business. I go to China, I'm doing Chinese business. I'm understanding and upholding their rights, their protocols, and their interests as a community, as a nation, and as a culture, right? That must be maintained here. And I believe the Indigenous standard or culture of business is evolving right now as we speak. And the kind of cultural practices and the standards, you associate like Germany, you associate Germany with high performance engineering, particularly Audi, right? Or Volkswagen. You think of other countries in the world too, and the kind of standards of their industry and innovation, right? And I believe that's what is really key and really critical, because Indigenous peoples are going to change the game when it comes to how we do business from an ideological perspective, from a philosophical perspective, from a cultural perspective, that's really what's going on. And that's what excites me is, what does that look like? And right now it's happening, so those Indigenous youth that are growing up today are going to be those future business moguls, are going to be very successful and have all the support around them from their communities, from their nations, and from Canada, right? And so for me, it's okay, well, how do we maintain that cultural relevance and support that?
No, I agree. And I think, we were talking about it today. You're doing a certificate in AI, right? And you're saying, and how are you going to, like, in your opinion, how is, the past and culture and the respect for it going to integrate with AI as well?
Yeah, so that's a really powerful question. In our class, we've been discussing the ethics of artificial intelligence in society. And one of the questions we had last time was, is artificial intelligence, can we give it personhood or the rights of a human being? And what are the ethics behind that? Who's liable, right? And also reviewing some different cases and challenges. And for artificial intelligence and Indigenous peoples, it represents an amazing opportunity for us to repatriate our languages, to create amazing digital libraries and archives of our culture, right? It also represents a space for us to interact with something that can be taught our cultural ways of being and informed in our traditions and act as almost as if it's a steward of culture. It acts in service of Indigenous communities to help enhance them and support them in prospering while still giving humanity our agency and our autonomy and the ability to make decisions and exercise a right and authority over artificial intelligence, right? And so it really presents a really amazing opportunity for us as Indigenous peoples to, again, repatriate, to support decision-making, develop far more complex governance systems, and to really hone and coordinate a space, a society. We're stewards. Why is artificial intelligence not a steward itself as well?
I think it's really important, and that brings up such a great point, because what is our world going to look like in 5 years? If you're not using artificial intelligence today and not learning it, then that's the only thing really tipping point between some businesses right now. And I think the youth have a huge advantage that there are going to be a lot of jobs and occupations that are going to be replaced by AI, organizational, data entry, social media, things like that, that can be scheduled. It's even happening now. What would your advice be to the youth in respect of going forward with a career and really investigating and researching what kind of jobs that won't be replaced by artificial intelligence, including protocols, culture, and the way that we relationship building? I think that we have children. We have 4 boys. The 2 youngest are 13 and 14 years old. And as you see a generation of kids that don't have their phones are literally glued to their hands. And if they're not watching YouTube on their phones, they're on their video games. So the social connection that is lacking, the relationship building that's lacking, and the actual connection with each other is a totally different game and model. So what would your advice be to the youth that are coming up today that feel that safety net of being behind a screen or being behind their phone when they go out to get a job now and look for careers? What would your advice be? Where do you see the future going?
My advice for those youth that are behind the screen, right, they're living in this digital age and digital era. So I think become experts in those subjects, right? Become far more fluent. Learn how to make social media or digital media, right, a tool, an agency of your career, your life, and your personhood, right? But I'd also recommend for those youth to, if artificial intelligence is going to be replacing a lot of things, and, that's still quite on the horizon, but we do have robots manufacturing different things. Now, commercial robots becoming available for in-home services and cleaning and other things like that. So I really think it comes down to how you master people skills, right? And that's the biggest thing I'd recommend is, first and foremost, get a mentor, right? Not a digital mentor or an AI mentor, a real mentor that you can connect with and learn from and debate amongst. Number 2 is expose yourself to more community events, right? And it's challenging and scary, though, for Indigenous youth. For myself, I've been doing this for many years now, and yeah, I may stand out and, at times appear very brash and things like that. But at the end of the day, these environments can be very toxic, right? Like very toxic. And you're feeling like you're walking on eggshells. Somebody's always watching you. And for Indigenous youth that are kind of behind that screen, right, my advice to them is just develop more confidence, right? Find something you attach yourself to, and that could be anything. But if you can become confident in that subject and that thing and speak from your Siawan or your spirit or your Nadan, that's where it comes from. My advice to them is get on the land, learn from your elders, be a part of community, and be present. And you can still do all the digital stuff.
I think that's where my next comment is. So your advice to the youth as parents, which we are, and a lot of our audience are parents, and we have children that are behind the screens and always on their phones. And when we go into community, and you've witnessed this as well, we go into communities all over Canada, we go to them, and parents sign their youth up. They're voluntold to be a part of programs. And I find this with our own children too. Getting them out of the house is the hardest thing, But when you're take them snowboarding up the mountain, or you take them hiking, or you get them out to the land, then it's totally different. But it has to be the parents' responsibility to do that. What's your advice for parents from a youth perspective on how we can do better, and how we can make better humans? And what is your advice from a youth?
Constantly reflect, right? I think parenthood, as leadership, parenthood at the end of the day is a form of leadership, right? And in order to be a competent and relevant leader, you must always be reflecting, right? Reflecting on how you could have done better, reflecting on the situations in society or some of the issues that are challenging. And, for better parenthood, it's really reflecting on their lessons, their habits, right? And how that may be, ingrained within that child or within that youth, because so much at the end of the day, like, the digital media and things like that is really, humans are creatures of habit, and we're raised and taught different things. And, in today's world, everything's so habitual and structured and so nobody pauses for a moment to reflect, right? On how my parenting may be affecting this child, right? Or how the things that I'm saying may be affecting this child, right? 10 years in the future. It's something so small as like, you're an idiot, right? Could really inhibit a youth's ability to succeed and to be empowered. So that would be my main piece of advice. And then number 2 is just respect, right? Respect for that young human beings developing autonomy and agency, right? To not keep the leash so tight, but to give them some autonomy and agency, and being like, you can begin to make decisions for yourself, right? And as they make mistakes, they'll continue to learn, and you'll be there to support them. But it's definitely number 1 is constantly reflect on yourself and how one's habits and behaviors may be, directly associated with some of the challenges of social media and getting out the house.
Oh, I can't wait till you become a parent and then everything starts to shift. So nice to hear from a youth that can talk about that, but it's a challenging time for sure. Before we wrap up, because we're going to be wrapping up, and it's been so amazing and honoring to listen to you speak, because you're so eloquent and educated. If you're an organization and you're listening, if you're whether you have a school program or whether you're an organization and you really want to get in touch with youth, how do we do that? Because I know that there's a lot of great supporters of what we do, including tech, including AME, including Scotiabank, including a lot of different supporters, the Arc'teryx, a lot of the supporters that we have that want to hear the voice of the youth, because as you mentioned, there's a huge pocket of not only entrepreneurs, but also a workforce that's coming upwards. And how do they connect with youth? And if you want also to talk about how you connect with youth, or you want a great speaker to come in, I think that you are incredible. And as everyone who's listening has heard. So first and foremost, how would people connect with the youth? And then how do people connect with you?
So I think first and foremost, when it comes to connecting with youth, is really coming in with an open mind, right? Like today, I think particularly in some of these spaces that I've really been around and some of the advisory work I've been doing, everybody's really scared. It's very fear-based, this developing relationship with the youth or Indigenous communities. It's very, very fear-based, and that limits and inhibits our ability to make effective decisions around how we engage youth or build community. So that'd be number 1. And then, number 2 is protocol, right? Recognizing and upholding protocol. And what does that mean? There's many different forms of cultural protocol throughout British Columbia, because we have 32 different nations here in BC. So it's really like that. It's lowering barriers and following protocol. And I think that's how you connect with youth and support their agency and development, and invite them to take a seat at the table. Not at the other table, invite them to take a seat at the table.
Not the kids' table.
Exactly.
The adults' table.
Exactly.
Very nice. Very nice. And you're a great public speaker. You're a great inspirational speaker for youth, and also for organizations that really want to develop not just reconciliation, but we like to call it reconciliation. How do people contact you and contact your consulting company?
For sure. Well, you can find Turtle Island Connection online, our website. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And you can also reach me by email at edgard@turtleislandconnection.ca. If that is something that is great interest, then definitely reach out and we can begin to developing some really amazing priorities and strategies that are really aligning our interests, supporting Indigenous youth, and creating spaces for Indigenous peoples to prosper and succeed within the modern economy.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Edgard. Such a great interview and conversation with you. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah.
And
love time with you. Can't wait for the next youth camp we get to spend a weekend together.
Yes, sir.
yeah, ones to watch.
Yeah.
Yes, Madu. Hajko Siam for bringing me here today.
Hoichka.
Yes.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Lair. Please follow us, download this episode, and follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok.